Bruno had never made that sound before. It wasn't a bark, and it wasn't a growl either. The massive golden retriever stood frozen outside the bathroom door, whining so hard that his entire body shook while Hannah Brooks stared at the positive pregnancy test trembling in her hand. For a moment, she actually laughed, brushing away nervous tears as she opened the door and knelt beside him. "You already know, don't you?" she whispered, scratching behind his ears, but the dog didn't react the way he normally did. Bruno didn't wag his tail. He didn't lick her face or bounce around excitedly like always. Instead, he pressed his nose against her stomach and let out another low, painful cry that made the hair on Hannah's arms stand up. 3 months later, the behavior only got stranger. Every single morning at exactly 5:17 a.m., Bruno climbed onto the bed and pushed his snout against the left side of Hannah's belly. He would sniff the same exact spot over and over before gently licking it in complete silence. Then he would stare at her with wide, restless eyes as if waiting for something terrible to happen. At first, Hannah thought it was sweet. She even filmed it for social media, joking that Bruno was already obsessed with the baby. But after a while, the videos started to feel disturbing, especially because the dog never acted that way toward the rest of her stomach. Only one place. Always the same place. "That's creepy," her husband Mason muttered one night while watching Bruno repeat the ritual for nearly 20 minutes straight. "Maybe he hears the heartbeat," Hannah replied, though even she didn't sound convinced anymore. Mason tried laughing it off, but Bruno's behavior kept escalating. The dog stopped eating unless Hannah sat beside him. He refused to leave her alone in any room. If she walked into the backyard, Bruno followed so closely that his fur brushed against her legs. Twice, he scratched frantically at the nursery door after hearing noises from inside, even though the room was empty. Then came the incident at Dr. Foster's office. Hannah was lying on the examination table during a routine prenatal checkup while Bruno waited beside her chair wearing his service harness. He had been trained since puppyhood and had never caused problems before. But the second the ultrasound technician moved the wand across Hannah's lower stomach, Bruno exploded into panic. The dog lunged forward so violently that the leash ripped from Mason's hand. Nurses jumped back in shock as Bruno planted both paws against the table and began whining directly at Hannah's belly. "Bruno, stop!" Mason shouted, pulling him away while the embarrassed technician forced an awkward smile. Dr. Emily Foster assured them everything looked normal, but Hannah noticed something strange as they left the office. Bruno wasn't looking at her face anymore. He kept staring at her stomach with frightened eyes, trembling like he was hearing something nobody else could hear. That night, rain hammered against the windows while Hannah stood in the nursery, folding tiny baby clothes beneath the soft yellow light. Bruno lay nearby, unusually quiet. Then suddenly, the dog bolted upright and started barking at the baby monitor sitting on the dresser. Hannah frowned and picked it up. Static crackled softly through the speaker. "Mason," she called out, confused, but before her husband could answer, Bruno charged forward and knocked the monitor out of her hand. The device hit the floor with a sharp crack, and through the burst of static, Hannah heard something that made her blood run cold. A second heartbeat. Hannah replayed the sound more than 20 times that night, sitting alone on the edge of the bed while rainwater slid slowly down the bedroom windows. Every replay ended the same way. One steady heartbeat. Then another faint rhythm buried underneath the static before the recording cut off completely. Mason insisted it had to be interference from another monitor nearby, but Hannah could not ignore Bruno's reaction. The dog had not barked randomly. He had heard it before the monitor ever touched the floor, and somehow that frightened him more than anything she had ever seen. After that night, Bruno changed again. The playful golden retriever who used to greet neighbors with a tennis ball in his mouth barely left Hannah's side anymore. He stopped sleeping downstairs and curled up beside her bed every single night, his body stretched toward her stomach as though he was guarding it. Sometimes Hannah woke up around 3 in the morning and found him already awake, staring silently at her belly in the darkness with exhausted eyes. It was the sadness in those eyes that unsettled her the most. Bruno did not look aggressive. He looked terrified. One afternoon, Hannah sat on the living room floor folding baby blankets while Bruno rested beside the couch. She smiled softly and held up a tiny pair of pink socks. "You are going to be her best friend, you know that," she whispered. Usually Bruno reacted whenever she mentioned the baby, but this time he lowered his head onto the carpet and let out a weak sigh. Hannah frowned. The dog had lost nearly 8 pounds in less than a month. His favorite treats sat untouched in the pantry. Even peanut butter barely interested him anymore. Mason tried convincing her it was anxiety caused by the upcoming changes in the house, but Hannah knew Bruno too well. This was not jealousy. This felt more like grief. A few days later, she found him sitting alone inside the nursery before sunrise. The room was still dark except for pale blue light from the street lamp outside. Bruno was lying directly beneath the crib mobile, staring upward as the tiny stars rotated slowly above him. Hannah crouched beside him and brushed her fingers through his fur. "What is happening to you?" she whispered. Bruno immediately stood up and pressed himself against her legs so tightly that she almost lost balance. Then he nudged her hand toward her stomach again and again until she finally rested her palm there. The baby kicked lightly beneath her skin. Bruno froze. For one brief second, Hannah thought she saw relief in his eyes, but it vanished almost immediately. That same evening, Mason came home carrying several grocery bags and stopped in the kitchen doorway. "This cannot keep going on," he said quietly while watching Bruno pace circles around Hannah's chair. "He is exhausting himself." Hannah glanced down at the dog. Bruno's nails clicked rapidly against the hardwood floor as he walked in restless loops, constantly looking back at her stomach between each turn. "Maybe we should take him to a vet," she admitted softly. The next morning, they drove Bruno to a veterinary clinic 15 miles away. The veterinarian examined him carefully and found nothing physically wrong. Healthy heartbeat, healthy lungs, healthy joints. Yet when the doctor tried separating Bruno from Hannah during the exam, the dog panicked so badly that tears formed in his eyes. He clawed desperately at the door until Hannah returned to the room. Even the veterinarian seemed disturbed afterward. "I have seen separation anxiety before," she said carefully, "but this feels different somehow. He acts like he is afraid something will happen if he cannot reach you." On the drive home, Bruno rested his head on Hannah's lap without moving once. Traffic crawled slowly through the wet streets while the windshield wipers swept back and forth in silence. Hannah absent-mindedly scratched behind his ears until her fingers suddenly stopped. Beneath Bruno's collar, hidden deep in his golden fur, she noticed several fresh scratches across his neck, as if he had been trying to tear the collar off himself. The scratches on Bruno's neck should not have been possible. Hannah noticed immediately that they were not random marks from playing outside or rough for rubbing against the collar. They formed narrow red lines directly beneath the buckle, almost as if Bruno had been trying to slip out of it for days. When she reached toward the collar to inspect it more closely, the dog jerked backward so suddenly that he stumbled against the car door. His breathing quickened. Then, to Hannah's surprise, Bruno lowered his head and pressed one paw against her stomach instead. "Okay," she whispered softly, unsettled by the strange exchange. "I will leave it alone." Over the next several days, Bruno's behavior became impossible to predict. Sometimes he acted completely normal for hours, lying peacefully beside the couch while Hannah watched television or folded baby clothes. Then, without warning, something invisible seemed to trigger him. One afternoon, Hannah was heating soup in the kitchen when Bruno suddenly sprinted from the living room and slammed his body against the oven door hard enough to rattle the glass. The dog barked furiously at the reflection in the oven window, while Hannah nearly dropped the spoon from her hand. "Bruno!" Mason shouted from across the house. But the dog would not stop. He kept barking at the dark reflection until Hannah stepped away from the stove entirely. The second she moved back toward the kitchen table, Bruno instantly calmed down and curled himself around her legs as though nothing had happened. Mason stared at him in disbelief. "This is getting seriously weird," he muttered. Another night, Hannah woke to the sound of scratching inside the hallway. At first, she assumed Bruno wanted water, but when she opened the bedroom door, she froze. Bruno had dragged every single baby item from the nursery into the hallway. Tiny blankets, stuffed animals, diaper boxes, even the folded stroller cover. The dog had piled them all directly outside the master bedroom door in a messy mound like some kind of barricade. Bruno sat beside the pile, panting heavily, his eyes fixed on Hannah's stomach. "Why would he do this?" Hannah whispered. Mason looked exhausted. "Maybe he thinks the nursery belongs to him now." But Hannah could tell even Mason no longer believed his own explanations. The following afternoon, things escalated again during a neighborhood barbecue at their neighbor Linda's house. Bruno normally loved people, especially children, But the second a little girl ran toward Hannah holding sparklers, Bruno reacted in a way nobody expected. He rushed between Hannah and the child so fast that drinks spilled across the patio table. Gasps erupted around the backyard as Bruno planted himself directly in front of Hannah, barking sharply at the crackling sparks in the girl's hands. The little girl burst into tears while Mason grabbed Bruno's harness in embarrassment. "I am so sorry." Hannah apologized repeatedly while neighbors exchanged uncomfortable glances. But even after the sparklers were extinguished, Bruno refused to calm down. His entire body trembled while he stared at the smoke drifting through the air. That night, Mason finally snapped. "This dog is becoming a danger," he said quietly. After Hannah climbed into bed. "What happens when the baby comes home?" Hannah looked toward Bruno lying near the bedroom door. The dog appeared exhausted, but he still kept lifting his head every few seconds to check on her. "He is scared," she whispered. "Of what?" Mason asked. Hannah did not have an answer. Around 2 in the morning, a loud metallic crash exploded downstairs. Mason bolted upright, while Bruno tore out of the bedroom before either of them could react. They rushed downstairs expecting to find an intruder or broken window, but instead they discovered Bruno standing in the dark kitchen beside the refrigerator. The dog had somehow pulled every magnet, photo, and paper note off the refrigerator door and scattered them across the floor. Hannah stared in confusion until she noticed one thing still hanging untouched in the center of the metal door. It was the latest ultrasound image. Bruno stood directly beneath it, whining softly while scratching at the cabinet drawer where Hannah kept the kitchen knives. The kitchen felt unbearably quiet after Mason pulled Bruno away from the cabinet drawer. The dog resisted harder than Hannah had ever seen before, twisting against the harness while letting out deep, desperate cries that echoed through the dark house. "Enough!" Mason snapped, dragging Bruno toward the laundry room. The moment the door shut behind him, scratching exploded against the other side so violently that Hannah flinched. She stared down at the ultrasound image still hanging alone on the refrigerator while her pulse hammered in her ears. "Why would he do that?" she whispered. Mason rubbed both hands over his face in frustration. "I do not know anymore, Hannah. But this is not normal." The next morning, Bruno refused to come out of the laundry room. Usually the sound of Hannah's footsteps was enough to make his tail thump against the floor instantly, but now he remained curled tightly in the corner beside the dryer. His eyes looked dull and exhausted. The scratches on his neck appeared worse in the daylight, and when Hannah crouched beside him, Bruno slowly pushed his head into her lap without making a sound. The silence hurt more than the barking ever had. "I think he knows we are upset with him," Hannah said quietly later that afternoon. Mason leaned against the kitchen counter, staring toward the hallway where Bruno lay motionless. "He terrified a child at the barbecue. He destroyed the kitchen last night. And now he is obsessed with your pregnancy to the point that he cannot function." Hannah opened her mouth to defend Bruno, but the words caught in her throat because part of her was beginning to feel afraid too. Not afraid that Bruno would hurt her. Afraid that something inside him was breaking apart. Over the next 2 days, tension filled the house like heavy storm clouds. Bruno was no longer allowed inside the nursery after Mason found him dragging baby blankets into the closet and stacking them in strange corners of the room. The dog also began reacting badly whenever electronic devices came near Hannah's stomach. Phones, tablets, even the portable speaker in the kitchen. One evening, Hannah tried playing soft lullaby music while organizing baby clothes, but Bruno suddenly rushed across the room and pawed the speaker off the shelf before curling protectively against her legs. "This has gone too far," Mason muttered. He sounded more tired than angry now. Hannah could not blame him. Neither of them had slept properly in weeks. Friends stopped bringing their children over. Their neighbors had started asking uncomfortable questions after the barbecue incident. Even Dr. Foster gently suggested that stress from Bruno's behavior might not be healthy during late pregnancy. Then came the moment that changed everything. Hannah was sitting on the front porch one afternoon when the mail carrier approached the house carrying a package. Bruno had been lying quietly beside her for almost an hour, calm for the first time all day. But the second the mail carrier stepped onto the porch holding the small electronic scanner against his chest, Bruno erupted. The dog lunged so suddenly that the package flew from the man's hands onto the porch steps. Hannah screamed in shock, while Mason sprinted outside from the garage. Bruno did not bite or snap. Instead, he planted himself directly between Hannah and the scanner device, barking uncontrollably while forcing the terrified mail carrier backward down the walkway. By the time Mason finally dragged Bruno into the house, the entire street had come outside to stare. That night, an animal behavior specialist named Claire Benson sat at their dining room table reviewing videos Hannah had recorded over the past month. She watched silently while Bruno licked Hannah's stomach, paced through the nursery, barked at electronics, and cried beside the ultrasound image. Finally, Claire lowered the tablet and looked directly at Mason. "I think your dog has developed a severe anxiety fixation connected to the pregnancy," she explained carefully. "In some cases, these obsessions can become unpredictable after the baby is born." Hannah's stomach tightened. "What are you saying?" Claire hesitated before answering. "For everyone's safety, you should consider temporarily removing Bruno from the home before the delivery." Upstairs, beyond the half-closed hallway door, Bruno sat silently at the top of the stairs listening to every word. Bruno stopped sleeping after the meeting with the animal behavior specialist. Hannah noticed it the very next night. Around 4 in the morning, she walked downstairs for water and found the golden retriever sitting motionless in the dark living room facing the front window. He did not react when she entered the room. He did not wag his tail or come closer. He simply sat there staring into the empty street while faint moonlight reflected across his tired eyes. For the first time since all of this began, Hannah felt something close to heartbreak instead of fear. Bruno looked like a dog waiting for goodbye. The next afternoon, Mason made a phone call to his cousin in Denver who owned a large farm outside the city. Hannah overheard pieces of the conversation from the kitchen. "Just until after the baby is born," Mason said quietly. "A few months at most." Bruno was lying beneath the dining room table during the call, but the second Mason spoke the words, "Take him next week," the dog slowly stood up and walked away from the room without making a sound. Hannah watched him disappear down the hallway and suddenly felt sick to her stomach. Later that evening, she found Bruno inside the nursery again, despite the baby gate blocking the doorway. Somehow the dog had managed to unlatch the gate without damaging it. He was sitting beside the crib with one of Hannah's pregnancy books lying open on the floor beside him. At first she assumed he had knocked it down accidentally until she noticed something strange. Bruno had torn only one page from the entire book. Just one. Hannah bent down and picked up the loose page from the carpet. It was a chapter discussing rare complications during late pregnancy, including hidden fetal abnormalities and overlapping heartbeat interference during ultrasounds. A chill crept slowly through her body. "That is impossible," she whispered under her breath. Bruno immediately stood and pressed his nose against the paper before whining softly. Hannah stared at the ripped page for a long moment before stuffing it into the book again. Coincidence. It had to be coincidence. Still, she could not stop thinking about it. That night, she barely slept. Around sunrise, she finally drifted off on the couch downstairs while Bruno curled beside her feet. She woke 2 hours later to the sound of faint beeping coming from the kitchen counter. Her old tablet screen had lit up with a low battery warning beside several open tabs from the night before. Pregnancy complications, fetal distress, hidden twin syndrome. Hannah rubbed her tired eyes and reached for the tablet, but Bruno suddenly stood upright beside the couch. His ears twitched sharply toward the device. Then he did something Hannah had never seen before. The dog carefully placed one paw directly against the tablet screen and dragged it toward her with deliberate slow movements until a paused audio clip appeared. It was the recording from the broken baby monitor. Hannah's throat tightened. Bruno looked from the screen to her stomach and then back again. "You want me to hear it?" she whispered. The dog let out a faint whine and rested his chin against her knee. Hands shaking slightly, Hannah pressed play once more. Static filled the room. One heartbeat, then another weaker rhythm buried beneath it. But this time, Hannah noticed something she had missed before. Right before Bruno started barking in the recording, a soft electronic pulse interrupted the second heartbeat for less than half a second. It sounded almost like interference or suppression. Hannah immediately remembered every moment Bruno had reacted violently toward electronics. The speaker, the scanner, the ultrasound equipment, even the kitchen appliances. Her breathing grew shallow as a terrible possibility entered her mind for the very first time. Maybe Bruno was not reacting to the pregnancy itself. Maybe he was reacting to something affecting it. Upstairs, Mason called down from the bedroom asking if she was awake. Hannah quickly grabbed the tablet and looked back at Bruno. The dog stood completely still now, watching her with desperate hope in his eyes. Slowly, Hannah reached for her phone and opened Dr. Foster's contact information again. This time, she was not calling for reassurance. She wanted another ultrasound. Dr. Emily Foster sounded confused when Hannah called requesting another emergency scan less than 48 hours after her last appointment. "Hannah, your previous ultrasound looked completely normal," she explained gently over the phone. "There is no indication anything is wrong." Hannah glanced toward Bruno lying beside the kitchen table. The dog had not taken his eyes off her since she picked up the phone. "Please," Hannah whispered. "I know this sounds irrational, but I need you to check again." 2 hours later, heavy rain pounded against the hospital windows while Hannah lay beneath the dim lights of the examination room. Mason stood beside her looking exhausted and embarrassed. Bruno was not allowed inside this time. Hospital policy after the previous incident. Hannah hated leaving him behind in the car, especially after the way he had cried when the nurse shut the parking garage door between them. Dr. Foster moved the ultrasound wand slowly across Hannah's stomach while gray shadows flickered across the monitor. "Everything still appears healthy," she said calmly. "Strong heartbeat. Growth is normal." Mason let out a relieved breath, but Hannah noticed something strange. Dr. Foster kept pausing every few seconds to adjust the imaging settings. Tiny lines of confusion formed between her eyebrows. "That is odd," she murmured quietly. "What?" Hannah asked immediately. Dr. Foster hesitated. "There is interference again." She pointed toward the lower corner of the screen, where faint distortion rippled across the image in rhythmic pulses. "Probably equipment sensitivity. It happened briefly during your last appointment, too." Hannah's heart began pounding. "Can you zoom in there?" For several long seconds, the room remained silent except for the machine humming softly. Then Dr. Foster adjusted the frequency settings manually instead of using the automatic filter. The screen suddenly flickered hard. A distorted pulse echoed through the speakers. Once, twice. Mason straightened beside the bed. "Wait," he whispered. Another heartbeat appeared beneath the first one. Faint, weak, but unmistakably real. Dr. Foster froze completely. "That cannot be right," she breathed. Her fingers moved quickly across the controls now, disabling layer filters one by one. The blurry shadows slowly separated on the monitor until Hannah finally saw it herself. Two tiny forms, one healthy and clearly visible, the other partially hidden behind the first, compressed into a dangerous position doctors had missed repeatedly because of overlapping signals and electronic filtering. "Oh my God," Hannah whispered, tears instantly filling her eyes. Dr. Foster stared at the screen in disbelief. "You are carrying twins." Mason looked like the air had been knocked out of him. "How could this happen?" he asked. But Dr. Foster was already calling for another specialist. Within minutes, the quiet room transformed into controlled chaos. More doctors arrived. Additional scans were rushed in. The hidden baby's heart rate was unstable and dangerously weak. Worse still, the second fetus was positioned in a way that caused intermittent signal distortion whenever certain electronic frequencies interfered with the monitor readings. That was why the automated equipment kept suppressing the weaker heartbeat. Hannah suddenly remembered every moment Bruno had panicked near electronics. The scanner at the barbecue, the speaker, the baby monitor, the ultrasound machine itself. He had never been reacting randomly. He had been reacting to the interference disrupting the hidden heartbeat. The weaker baby likely would not have survived much longer without intervention, one of the specialists admitted carefully, especially if the compression continued undetected. Hannah covered her mouth as tears rolled down her cheeks. Mason slowly lowered himself into a chair, staring blankly at the monitor. For weeks they had called Bruno unstable, dangerous, obsessed, but the dog had been trying desperately to warn them the entire time. Every bark, every strange reaction, every sleepless night. Suddenly the examination room door burst open. A nurse rushed inside looking startled. "I am sorry," she said breathlessly, "but somebody needs to come downstairs right now." Mason frowned. "Why?" The nurse pointed toward the hallway window overlooking the parking garage below. "Your dog somehow escaped the car." Hannah's stomach dropped. She pushed herself upright just enough to look through the rain-streaked glass. Down below, Bruno stood soaking wet in the middle of the emergency entrance, surrounded by hospital staff. But he was not barking anymore. The exhausted golden retriever simply stared upward toward Hannah's hospital floor with trembling legs, as if waiting to make sure both babies were finally safe. Mason pressed one shaking hand against his forehead and whispered the words that shattered Hannah completely. We were about to send him away. Hannah could not stop staring at Bruno through the rain-covered hospital window. The golden retriever looked exhausted beneath the flashing emergency lights outside, his fur soaked flat against his body, while nurses cautiously stood several feet away from him. Yet even after everything, Bruno was still not trying to run inside the building. He was simply waiting for confirmation that the babies were alive. Hannah suddenly remembered every moment she had doubted him over the past month, and the memories hit her so hard she could barely breathe. Bruno dragging baby blankets out of the nursery. Bruno barking at the ultrasound equipment. Bruno refusing to leave her side at night. Bruno sitting alone by the front window like a dog carrying a secret nobody believed. None of it had been aggression. None of it had been madness. He had been terrified. I told Claire he was dangerous, Mason whispered hoarsely beside her. His face had gone pale as he stared down at the parking lot below. I called my cousin to take him away. Hannah covered her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks again. She remembered Bruno lying silently in the laundry room after overhearing those plans. The sadness in his eyes suddenly made horrible sense now. He had known they no longer trusted him, even while he was desperately trying to save their children. Dr. Foster remained unusually quiet while reviewing the new scans beside the wall monitor. Finally, she turned toward them with visible emotion in her expression. I have worked in maternal medicine for 14 years, she said softly, and I have never seen anything like this. She glanced toward the rain-covered window where Bruno still stood outside. Your dog noticed a hidden medical problem before multiple advanced scans detected it. Hannah let out a shaky breath and slowly lowered herself back onto the hospital bed. Every strange moment replayed differently in her mind now. The barbecue incident. Bruno barking at sparklers and smoke. The scanner device near the mailbox. The ripped pregnancy book page. Even the kitchen knives. Hannah suddenly realized Bruno had not been scratching at the knives themselves that night. He had been scratching at the drawer directly beneath the ultrasound photo taped to the refrigerator. The drawer where they kept aluminum foil and metal shielding wraps for food storage. He had been trying to lead them toward interference. Oh my God, Hannah whispered through tears. He was trying to show us. Mason sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed, his eyes wet with guilt. And we punished him for it. Downstairs, security staff had finally placed a loose leash around Bruno's harness, but the dog still refused to move away from the emergency entrance. Hospital workers walked around him cautiously while rainwater pooled beneath his paws. Then Hannah saw something that shattered her heart completely. Bruno slowly lowered himself onto the wet pavement and rested his head across his front legs exactly the same way he used to sleep outside Hannah's bedroom door every night. Even now, exhausted and abandoned in the storm, he was guarding them. I need to see him, Hannah said suddenly. Dr. Foster immediately shook her head. You need monitoring right now. Please, Hannah begged softly. He thinks we sent him away because he failed. The room fell silent. Even Mason could not look at her after hearing those words. A few minutes later, one of the nurses carefully wheeled Hannah toward the hospital entrance while Mason walked beside her carrying blankets. The automatic doors slid open and cold rain-scented air rushed inside. Bruno instantly lifted his head. For one brief second the dog looked uncertain, almost afraid to come closer. Hannah's chest tightened painfully at the sight. Slowly she reached out one trembling hand toward him. Bruno hesitated only a moment before walking carefully to her wheelchair and resting his head against her stomach again exactly like he had done from the very beginning. But this time Hannah finally understood why. Tears rolled freely down Mason's face as he crouched beside the dog and whispered, I am so sorry, buddy. Bruno closed his eyes the moment Hannah's fingers touched his wet fur, and for the first time in weeks, the trembling in his body finally stopped. Inside the hospital behind them, doctors were already preparing an emergency treatment plan for the hidden baby. But Hannah only held Bruno tighter as another terrible realization settled into her heart. If they had sent him away even one day earlier, nobody would have discovered the truth in time. The following 36 hours became a blur of hospital lights, whispered conversations, and careful monitoring as specialists worked to stabilize the hidden baby's condition. Hannah remained under observation in a private maternity suite while machines tracked both heartbeats separately for the first time. One heartbeat stayed strong and steady. The other still drifted dangerously at times, especially whenever certain monitoring equipment malfunctioned or lost signal. Yet through all of it, one thing changed almost immediately. Bruno stopped panicking the moment the doctors adjusted the equipment manually and shielded the weaker heartbeat from electronic interference. It was as if the dog could finally sense the babies were being heard correctly. Hospital staff had originally refused to let Bruno remain inside the maternity wing after the incident in the parking lot, but Dr. Foster personally overruled the decision after reviewing the case with hospital administration. By the second day, nurses quietly began referring to Bruno as the guardian dog. Hannah noticed that even the staff who once looked nervous around him now smiled whenever he padded slowly through the hallway beside Mason. But the biggest change happened inside Bruno himself. The constant trembling disappeared. He finally began eating again after nearly a week of refusing full meals. One nurse even laughed softly after seeing Bruno gently carry his food bowl down the hallway and place it outside Hannah's hospital room before touching it himself, as if he refused to eat unless she was safe nearby too. Late one evening, Hannah woke from a short nap and noticed the room felt unusually peaceful. Rain no longer battered the windows. The harsh storm clouds had finally cleared outside, leaving soft moonlight spilling across the hospital floor. Bruno lay beside the bed with his chin resting on his front paws while the heart monitors hummed steadily nearby. For several quiet minutes, Hannah simply watched him breathe. The deep exhaustion around his eyes looked different now, softer somehow. "You thought nobody understood you," she whispered. Bruno slowly lifted his head. Hannah reached toward the hospital tray table beside her and picked up the folded paper the nurses had brought earlier that afternoon. It was the transfer form Mason had almost signed to send Bruno away to Denver. Hannah stared at the document for a long moment before carefully tearing it into tiny pieces, one strip at a time. Bruno watched silently from the floor. Then, for the first time in weeks, his tail gave a slow, gentle wag against the tile. The next morning, Mason arrived carrying something unusual under one arm. It was the old wooden nameplate Bruno had worn above his dog bed since puppyhood. But Mason had painted something new beneath it during the night. In uneven dark blue letters, it now read, "Bruno, protector of the Brooks twins." Hannah burst into emotional laughter the moment she saw it. Even Dr. Foster smiled when Mason hung the small sign carefully beside the hospital room door. Word spread quickly through the maternity floor after that. Nurses stopped to pet Bruno during shifts. One orderly secretly brought him grilled chicken from the cafeteria every evening. Another nurse clipped a tiny blue hospital badge onto Bruno's harness with the words "Security Team" printed across the front. Yet despite all the attention, Bruno never acted proud or excited. Every few hours, he simply stood beside Hannah's bed, rested one ear lightly against her stomach, and listened quietly until both heartbeats settled into rhythm again. Then one final moment happened that nobody in the room would ever forget. During a routine overnight scan, the weaker heartbeat suddenly strengthened enough to match the first baby almost perfectly for the very first time. The nurse monitoring the equipment gasped softly and called Dr. Foster into the room. Hannah looked toward the monitor in disbelief while two healthy rhythms echoed evenly through the speakers together. Beside the bed, Bruno slowly lifted his head. The dog closed his eyes, released one long, exhausted breath, and finally fell into the deepest sleep anyone had seen from him in over a month. 3 weeks later, sunlight poured softly through the maternity ward windows as Hannah held both newborn girls against her chest for the first time. The delivery had come earlier than expected, but the doctors were prepared now. Every specialist in the room knew about the hidden heartbeat that almost disappeared before anyone except a frightened golden retriever noticed it. One baby slept quietly wrapped in a pale yellow blanket, while her sister stretched tiny fingers into the warm hospital light. Healthy, breathing steadily, alive, Mason stood nearby, unable to stop, smiling, though every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the corner of the room where Bruno lay sleeping beneath the twins' bassinets. The dog had barely left their side since the birth. Even during the exhausting overnight hours inside the hospital nursery, Bruno somehow sensed whenever one of the babies became restless before the monitors even sounded. Nurses started joking that the hospital should officially hire him before discharge day. But Hannah noticed something deeper than jokes. Bruno no longer looked afraid. The nervous pacing had vanished completely. The haunted exhaustion in his eyes had softened into calm watchfulness. It was as though the heavy, invisible burden he had carried for months had finally lifted. On the morning they prepared to leave the hospital, Dr. Foster visited one last time carrying a small folder beneath her arm. Inside were printed ultrasound images from every stage of Hannah's pregnancy. She placed the scans carefully across the bed, while explaining how the second baby had remained hidden behind overlapping positioning and irregular signal distortion. Most likely, she admitted quietly, the weaker heartbeat would have faded beyond recovery before we discovered her naturally. Hannah looked down toward Bruno beside the bassinets. The dog slowly opened one eye as though he recognized the conversation immediately. Dr. Foster smiled faintly before adding something none of them would ever forget. I think your dog heard a child disappearing before the machines did. The ride home felt strangely emotional for all of them. Bruno sat silently between the two infant car seats in the back row of the family SUV while Hannah watched him through tears from the passenger seat. Several times during the drive, one of the babies stirred softly in her sleep, and Bruno would gently press his nose against the edge of the car seat until she settled again. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Hannah noticed something waiting on the front porch. Their neighbors had placed a handmade wooden sign beside the flower pots near the door. Painted across the front in uneven blue and gold letters were the words, "Welcome home, little girls." "Thank you, Bruno." Hannah burst into tears all over again. Even Mason had to stop walking for a moment to compose himself before carrying the bassinets inside. But the most emotional moment came later that evening after the house finally grew quiet. The twins slept peacefully inside the nursery while soft music drifted through the hallway. Hannah stood in the doorway watching Bruno carefully circle the cribs one final time before settling himself directly between them on the floor. Not guarding anymore. Resting. She slowly realized this was the first time Bruno had willingly closed his eyes inside the nursery since the entire nightmare began. Hannah knelt beside him and gently removed the old collar from around his neck. The same collar he had scratched desperately for weeks while trying to warn them. Mason replaced it with a new soft leather collar carrying a small silver tag engraved with just 3 words, "They heard you." Bruno looked up at them quietly while Hannah stroked the fur along his neck where the scratches had finally begun to heal. Then the golden retriever rested his head beside the twins' cribs and drifted peacefully to sleep while 2 tiny heartbeats echoed safely through the room he had protected all along. Sometimes the purest souls do not speak because they were never meant to be ignored.